Hey guys, welcome back to this week's episode of Warfare in the Ancient World, where we are going to be moving south from Mesopotamia to talk about the Egyptian chariot. We're going to do that through the lens of one battle, which is, at least as of this year's date, the earliest surviving record of a complete battle with formations and units, uh, all of the things that we expect out of a detailed battle narrative. We have earlier mentions of parts of battles before, but this is the first beginning to end account, which is not to say that this account is necessarily reliable, because the account comes from the propaganda of Ramses II. You met him in your reading. He is one of the most well-known megalomaniacs of the Bronze Age, and that's a really competitive field. Yeah, but Ramses II was a very effective self-publicist, so much so that he's probably the pharaoh that you've heard of if you've heard of Egyptian pharaohs. He gets identified with the pharaoh of Exodus, and this is just a footnote. We do not now think that he is the pharaoh of Exodus. The dating just doesn't work out well, but because he was the pharaoh in Ten Commandments and then Prince of Egypt, that idea hangs out. I'm a little fond of Ramses II. I don't know, I have a soft spot for megalomaniacs who aren't in charge of me. Now, for this week, I've given you some readings, including translations of the primary source documents about this battle, a couple discussions of the battle's narrative, its immediate context. All of these links I've given you on the schedule. And before you watch this lecture, you should have already watched the Building Pharaoh's Chariot documentary. This is talking about chariots in an earlier period, about 200 years earlier. I think they're using Thutmose III's chariot, or Thutmose III, one of the Thutmoses. Ramses is using a slightly later chariot, but essentially the chariot design hasn't changed much since Thutmose, and it's a really cool documentary. A few things about the introduction of the chariot to Egypt, and then we'll move into the details you need to understand what's going on in the Kadesh narratives. If you look on the maps, you'll see Mesopotamia. Here, let me get my blue pen. So Mesopotamia is here on this map, and on this closer map here. Why are you not drawing? There's Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is where we were last week. The Proto-Indo-European peoples are way up north. They're off the map here. Anatolia is here. Also the site of Troy. That's going to be useful next week. Here's Anatolia on this map. Egypt is to the south of both of these. When the chariot arrived in Mesopotamia and became widely available, it caused some kind of a destabilization of existing political structures. Now, there's a lot of scholarly debate about this, so I'm going to refuse to open a can of worms and just go with this. When the chariot arrived, it went from north to south, and one of the knock-on effects of the introduction of the chariot was a change-up in dynasties in Egypt. When this first happened, it seems that the chariot caused the collapse of one dynasty and then the introduction of another. There's also some indication, and again, there's a lot of debate about how literal we should read this. There seems to have been a great loss of territory that had to be regained by subsequent Egyptian dynasties. And they did this by figuring out how to make their own chariots and then optimizing those chariots for Egyptian-style warfare. And this is an important distinction to make. Notice I'm not saying optimize chariot design point blank, because you don't just optimize design in a vacuum. There is no one perfect version of the chariot. There's a chariot that is made to work really well in your specific context, on the terrain you're fighting with, and if you don't change up your technology to fit new areas and new battlefields and new opposition tactics, your chariot, no matter how awesome your chariot is, it's not necessarily gonna be the best chariot. So Egypt began optimizing the chariot for Egyptian warfare. The documentary talks you through this process. I'm not going to repeat it. What you essentially need to know is that these were successful modifications. Egyptian chariots became a high-performance vehicle in their own right, and they were successful enough to allow Egypt not only to retake territory that had been lost when people from the north with their chariots made inroads into the Nile River Valley, but they were able to take their chariot and to conquer territory in the Levant, which I'm circling now on both maps. The Levant is this strip of seafront territory facing the Mediterranean along the inner coast of the Near East. So Anatolia is to the north. The Levant is this strip of land that faces the Mediterranean on the Arabian Peninsula. Here's the Red Sea. And then Egypt is the country centered on the Nile River Valley. More about why the Nile is such attractive real estate coming up. Now, the Levant was in a constant state of turnover for pretty much all of its history, and in fact, there is still competition for territory in the modern Levant because this is heavily settled, it's on several major trade routes, it's a reasonably fertile land, not like Nile River Valley fertile, but good for growing crops. So a lot of people lay claim to this region for a lot of different reasons that I'm not going to touch right now because this isn't that class. But just suffice it to say that this is an area without a lot of natural geographic stopping points. So if you're trying to grab land, moving north and south along the Levant is about the only way you can go. Inland into the Arabian Peninsula, you quickly get very rocky, mountainous, difficult terrain because of how the ground buckles. But along the coast, it's relatively flat. If you have wheeled vehicles, you can bring them. If you have ships, you can use the sea as your point of entry. So the Levant is pretty porous. There aren't a lot of mountains until you get to, say, the Sinai Peninsula or north. Once you start hitting the mountain ridges of Anatolia, there it suddenly becomes harder to grab more territory. So that explains where the competition is heavy and why people are sending their invasion forces in this direction. In the time of Tutmosis I and his successors, Egypt expanded this border to its maximum northern extent. You can see here with this red line that I'm highlighting now in this increasingly messy scribble, the Egyptians managed to take their territorial boundaries all the way up to where the mountains start in the Hittite Empire, which was then emerging. By Ramses II's day, the Hittites rather had made serious inroads, due in part to their developments in chariot technology. They had created a heavier chariot, slightly less maneuverable, but more armored with a larger crew. This makes a lot of sense if you think about the Hittites' territory. Very mountainous, much wetter than Egypt, cold enough that it's got winter snow. In fact, here is where Ankara is. I'm scribbling on it here, but it's right in the center of Anatolia. That's the modern capital of Turkey, because it is this deep, hilly territory that's very easy to control. So out of that center, Hittite chariots had begun pecking away at Egyptian borders, leaving us with the situation at the beginning of the Battle of Kadesh. And here I'm going to erase everything, or at least try to erase some of the things. This isn't working well. Come on, erase. There we go, erase. Great. Clean map. Okay. So Ramses II inherited a border that was to the south of Tutmosis. This is a problem for Ramses because he's the second in a new dynasty. A dynasty is a group, usually related by blood but not always, who pass control of territory from one to the next in a line. Dynasties are broken when somebody else manages to disrupt that process. So either with a coup or a power grab, or the last living person in the family dies and you need a new family to come in and take control. This was the more violent option. So Seti I, Ramses' father, had, through force of arms, taken over control of Egypt and passed that control down to Ramses II, which means Ramses II is under a lot of pressure. His dynasty hasn't been in control for long, and the second link in the dynastic chain can be particularly weak, because you don't have a dynasty until you've passed it on a couple of times. Like, that first handoff is a really delicate handoff. So if Ramses screws this up, he's going to lose control of the empire. Other Egyptians are going to try to grab the throne for themselves. Maybe people from outside Egypt will try to grab the throne. So Ramses is facing a bit of a PR problem. He's also very young. I think he was in his late teens when he takes control of the empire. And that is already something that will make you look weak in certain circles. So what he's got to do is convince first the nobility and then everybody in Egypt, but mostly the nobility, that he is their best bet for continued financial security. A really good way to do that is by conquering more territory. Empires love it when you conquer more territory because that means your rich people are going to get richer. The people that you capture in warfare and then subsequently traffic are going to create even more capital growth, which is really messed up. I want to make sure you don't think that I think that that is normal or okay. Enslaving people, not okay. But that's part of what war does in the ancient world, is you get manpower and financial resources and territory in a prime area where you're controlling a lot of trade. And if Egypt has this territory, nobody else has it. And that's the important. Sometimes you don't grab something because you want it. You grab it because you don't want somebody else to have it. You see where I'm going here? Now, it's not just rich people in Egypt who benefit, though. People who are involved in this campaign, if they don't die, get loot, they get money they can send home to their people, it counts as part of their tax burden. But if your country is stable, generally speaking, as long as your pharaoh isn't a really bad pharaoh, incompetent and capricious, generally speaking, for your average citizen, you're going to do better if there's stability at the top. More or less. Now, we've been pushing back against this idea that empire is good for everybody in the empire in recent years, because one of the things that happens when you're part of a large territory is your tax burden grows too. So sometimes not being controlled by outside forces can actually be better for your average citizen. So we have to be a little cautious with this, but generally speaking, you are going to get points and political support from the common folk if they see you as a successful god king. And god king is also part of the deal here. We'll talk more about how declaring yourself to be a god is a legitimate and viable approach to leadership in the ancient Bronze Age, and indeed the ancient world in general. This is a classic. Should you ever find yourself in charge of an empire, you may need to think about this ahead of time, so I'll just be throwing out some pro tips there. Right. So Ramses really wants to add territory to the empire. He wants to make sure that the borders, at the very least, stay where they are. Like, shrinking borders, that's bad for PR. So expanding is good, stabilizing is okay. Victory makes you look young and strong and competent, and the last thing he wants is for other people to take him seriously. This is another problem with being a young monarch, is that there are all these other kingdoms and empires and people groups in the Eastern Mediterranean in the Bronze Age who are all watching Egypt to see if the pharaoh is going to be weak so that they can then jump in. Egypt is the superpower in this region. They're the big guy on the block. But this also means that everybody is looking for you to screw up. It's a lot of pressure on Ramses. And if other kings think that he's a young idiot, they're going to try stuff. So part of what Ramses wants to do is make everybody else in the region not want to mess with him. So he takes his army north and rides into the Levant, trying to take back territory from the Hittite Empire. This map shows you the line that Ramses is trying to move. Let me do this in a less disappearing ink. There we go. Yeah, so where the red line is here. So that's the starting position. This is marked in green on the closer map. And you can also see the city of Kadesh along the Orontes River. It's right here. Here's the city of Kadesh. The river that runs through it is a major transport system for the region. It sits on a hill overlooking that river, and that's why Ramses is trying to go drive the Hittites out of Kadesh. If he can get that city stronghold, he can control the river Orontes and control the trade on it and all of the surrounding farmlands there. There are a bunch of other little city-states in this area, including Ugarit here in the north, which the Hittites also have control. So that's Ramses' dream, is he's going to roll into Kadesh with his massive chariot army. And this is a 4-unit chariot army, also with infantry and support vehicles and extra horses. Like, this is, for the Bronze Age, a really honkin' big invasion force that takes enormous resources. And because it has so many charioteers, remember, charioteers and archers are drawn from the upper classes. So it's not just about winning, but also powerful people's kids are in these chariots. And if he gets a bunch of them killed, that might be super awkward at his next ceremonial dinner party. Okay, so the pressure is on. But not just for those reasons. Let's talk about power some more. Because the gig of Egyptian pharaoh works a little bit differently than king gigs in the modern world do. This is because the pharaoh, theologically speaking, in ancient Egyptian religion, was a divine figure. The pharaoh was the living representative of the god Horus. So Horus is a god with a falcon head. You can see him in this picture here on the left. There's Horus, looking all spiffy, with the sun disk on his head. He is the god whose power makes itself manifest in the Pharaoh of Egypt. So the Pharaoh of Egypt is literally Horus, just with a human body, and the Pharaoh is also Horus. So when you're talking to the Pharaoh, the godhood is quite literal. Now, Horus in Egyptian mythology is the son of the goddess Isis and the god Osiris. Osiris is in charge of dead people in the underworld. When the pharaoh dies on Earth, he becomes the god Osiris in death. So that's how they get around this, oh, but the pharaoh dies, gods don't die. Well, actually, yeah, in this theology they do. But death is a transformation into an eternal form of yourself. It's kind of ascending, only you're descending because the afterlife is downwards in Egypt, not upwards. And this is true for every pharaoh. So Osiris is all dead pharaohs simultaneously. It works. What this... Now I'm going to go at this way. If you are the living embodiment of Horus, you have a specific job while you're in charge of the Empire of Egypt. And that is to preserve a concept, also a deified concept, called Ma'at. So Ma'at, when she's pictured, is shown holding a feather, and that feather is the symbol of balance. just like a feather to rest it point down on your hand, you have to have perfect balance. The pharaoh has to perfectly balance all aspects of Egypt in order to rule it properly. This idea of balance as our definition of good, both leadership and good leadership, good administration, good religious policy, all of that manifests itself in a number of different ways. One of the ways I've given you an image of, this is Ramses II in one of his many self-portraits that he had carved into his many temples that he built. This is showing Ramses. You can tell it's the pharaoh because of this helmet crown thing he's got on. This is the war crown of the pharaoh. In his hand, he's holding his war hammer. We'll look at an actual example of the war hammer later. With his right hand, he's holding by the hair 3 conquered peoples, and this grabbing by the hair posture is the way that Bronze Age art, whether it's in Mesopotamia or in Egypt, shows that you have conquered somebody. Sometimes they'll also be tied up on their knees. But this is the posture that you take in art before you lift your weapon and bash them in the head. So this is the moment right before the pharaoh kills all these people. This is a very unsubtle way of showing the power of the pharaoh on your temple wall. Very literal here, the relationship between violence and rule. Richardson talks about this a lot, the idea that a state is a state because the state has a pass to do violence, and all permission to do violence has to come with approval of the state. This is that in art. Now you'll also notice that there are 3 different kinds of people that he's holding by the hair simultaneously. They look short. This isn't because they're literally short people. Rather, this is because the pharaoh is a god. These people are not gods. Gods are bigger than mortals. So there's a divine element, but also it's a power move. It's our pharaoh is bigger than your kings. Then if you look at skin tone, you can see that there are people who are both darker and lighter than Ramesses, and one person who's kind of about the same tone, just a little redder. This is an indication of one of the ways that Egyptians thought of human difference and perhaps early concepts of race. This is not the same as the construct of race that people in America are familiar with. Egyptians thought that they were superior because they were middle toned, not too light, not too dark, not too red, right in the middle. And it's not just about skin tone with them in the same way that our system of race is super obsessed with how much melanin you have. Rather, for Egyptians, they're like, because balance is the ultimate good and we are the most medium of all people, that means we're the most balanced people and therefore superior. I mean, it's still a shitty way to think about human difference, but it's a different system of superiority than the one that you or I might have grown up with. What else did I want to say about this? As a part of this is making a geographical point too, and this is a spoiler for the rest of this lecture. Each of these people comes from a different border. So the very pale person is a Hittite. That's somebody from the northeast border of Egypt, the one we were just looking at. The very dark-skinned person is from the southern border of Egypt, the border around where the border between Egypt and the modern Sudan are today. This would be ancient Punt or Kush. The reddish-looking person is probably from ancient Libya. So this is west of Egypt along the coast of North Africa. And these are the 3 open borders of Egypt. Everything else is bounded by desert. So along the Nile River Valley, you just have desert. It's part of what makes Egypt such attractive real estate. The only way you can really get into the valley is northward through the delta, which is swampy and hard to navigate, or south through the headwaters of the Nile, which is full of waterfalls, so you can't like put your fleet on the river and sail it into Egypt easily. You can if you're determined, you just have to really know what you're doing. So by showing himself this way, Ramses is publicizing his full control over Egypt's borders. This is a visual that demonstrates for his people that Ramses is in charge and you are not, and therefore you should do what he says. It's not subtle. There's just a lot to unpack there. Okay, so let's look at some more examples of how Ramses indicated to his people that he was the best person to maintain Ma'at, balance. We're looking now at a reconstruction of his Luxor temple. This is one of many temples Ramses had built during his reign, which was very long. He lived into his 90s. He started his gig as pharaoh when he was in his teens, so he was there for a long time. It's like the Queen Elizabeth of ancient Egypt. Elizabeth II, well, really both Elizabeths this would work for, wouldn't it? At any rate, here then is the front-facing side of the temple reconstructed with the paint intact. Ancient statues, including Greek and Roman stuff, was all painted back in the day. So the white bleached out ruins that we see today isn't what it would have looked like. It would have been super colorful. This is no exception. This is a very colorful temple. And this is a temple not necessarily dedicated to any specific god, except maybe Ramses. In fact, if you look at the front, there are all of these statues of very large humans. You can see human figures at the center just for scale. So tiny, tiny humans, giant statues. All of these statues are statues of Ramses II. And this isn't it. Like when you go inside, you see like there are other statues inside. So there are more statues of Ramses. You can't like throw a rock without hitting a gigantic statue of Ramses II in a Ramses II temple. The obelisks in the front, these pointy structures here, are another symbol of power. We have erected a large stylus-shaped thing which has Ramses' name all over it, and the hieroglyphs on these obelisks and on these temple walls are the source for the poem of Pentaur in your reading. So if you were wondering where this account of the Battle of Kadesh is, well, it's on the temple walls. So it's not even like we haven't found a book. What we have found is the story of the battle carved into the temple in giant letters so everybody can see it. Very unsubtle. Next slide. We're going to zoom in a little bit on the front face of the temple. So here we're back behind the obelisks a little bit, closer up on the many Ramses statues. And here you can see the text of the poem of Pentaur. So here it is the text. There's a little extra text at the top. But then between the text, we have an artistic representation of the battle itself. Here's the Orontes River flowing around the city of Kadesh. The city of Kadesh here in the middle, different units of Hittites and their chariots. And then facing the Hittites in his own chariot is yet another giant portrait of Ramses II. I'm going to look at this closer on the next slide. Here we go. And here we are looking at Ramses' depiction of the decisive moment in the battle. This is in your reading. I'm not going to go through it in too much detail, except to say that I love the way that this altercation starts, where like a young, late teenage Ramses comes rolling up with his 4 chariot divisions. He captures these 2 Shashu nomads, and then he brings them in. He's like, "Hey guys, where's Mu'atali?" And they're like, "Oh man, dude, Mu'atali is just so afraid of you that he went to Aleppo with all of his chariots, and so like you are just free to invade." And Ramses doesn't seem to ask a lot of follow-up questions. He's like, "Brah, that's awesome. I am a god king. Cool. Let's go." So he takes his division, the Amun division, and they move on ahead to an advanced camp that the Egyptians have set up with provisions and support stuff. When he arrives, his scouts inform him that Oh, crap. Muatali is actually behind the hill. Right here, there's Muatali. And as Ramses and his division are moving northwards, Muatali swings around, hits their column, breaks through, and then loops around to take the Egyptian camp, which is very smart of them, because if the Egyptians don't have access to their camp, they can't have lunch, they don't have a place to stay, they're just like hanging out on a floodplain with their chariots and a bunch of angry war horses. This is not a position you want to be in. So at this point, Ramses is like, oh crap, I'm here alone with just my bodyguard. Apparently at one point he gets cut off. We should take this next bit with a real grain of salt. Ramses tells us that everybody else was running away. All of my troops were running away, and just me, alone, with my bodyguard, but just me and my bodyguard, fought off the Hittites single-handedly and turned the tide of battle. Guys, maybe if you're in a superhero movie, this makes tactical sense. I have a lot of questions. Maybe his bodyguard was very, very large. He seems to be very large, maybe. This is yet another instance, by the way, of Ramses showing himself steering with his butt because he's too cool to have a charioteer. He had a charioteer. One of the many things that should make us pause with this battle narrative, yes. But at any rate, according to Ramses again, at this point, the Egyptians manage to retake the camp. The other Egyptian brigades show up, and they're able to fight the Hittites to something Ramses calls victory, but they don't invade the Hittite camp. The Hittites are forced back across the river to their home base. At this point, everybody stops and negotiates a ceasefire that later becomes the Kadesh Treaty. We're going to look at the Kadesh Treaty. That's the other part of your reading, was a compare and contrast of the Egyptian version of the treaty. We have the Egyptian copy, and we have the Hittite copy, which is unheard of. It's our earliest international peace treaty ever, anywhere. It was on display in the UN for just that reason. Its home is at the Museum of Anatolian Antiquities for the cuneiform copy. The Egyptian copy is carved onto the walls of Ramses' temple, because Ramses goes home and he tells everyone, oh my gosh, I am so awesome, I won this battle in Kadesh, and I'm the best pharaoh ever. Also, here's this nifty peace treaty. But he doesn't kill all of the Hittites. There don't seem to be large numbers of them captured. The two people who lied to him about the location of Muatali's army end up being beaten. There's actual art of this on Ramses' temple we'll be looking at in a minute. But what we're talking about here is not so much a victory as it is a draw. Both parties withdraw, they come to an agreement. This is the end of the Egyptian advance in the northeast. Ramses moves on to other battlefields because there are two other borders for him to go secure. But Ramses makes it sound pretty awesome, doesn't he? Okay, so on the temple wall then, there's Ramses. In this art, he is all alone. Like, I can't even see his bodyguard. Where is his bodyguard? These are all of the Hittites that he is herding before him into the Orontes River. Here it's showing more Hittites in the river. Here also you can see Hittites that Ramses has already trampled beneath his chariot. According to Ramses, Ramses is a literal god of war. It's very hard to fact check this, but we would be right to be a little brow-raising and suspicious of this. Okay. Here we see in another, what do we call it, bas-relief sculpture from another temple. Here's more fan art of the Battle of Kadesh. This time, instead of showing the citadel of Kadesh, they're showing this decisive moment again, except we're zooming in a little bit so we can see Ramses all alone. This might be his bodyguard. Maybe, but that kind of looks like a Hittite team too. Yeah, no, you can't see his bodyguard. Maybe this is his bodyguard, like up here. One of them, you'll notice, has grabbed onto the feet of a flailing Hittite charioteer. That's a nice little artistic touch. So this is showing the Hittites' chariots being pushed into the river and the Hittites drowning in mass. This is not coincidentally the moment that makes Ramses II look the most badass. It's unsurprising that he would feature this in the Instagram story of the Kadesh battle. Let's talk about Egyptian versus Hittite chariots. And this is going to focus more on the Hittite end because you've seen the movie about Egyptian chariots. So Egyptian chariots are spec'd out for desert riding without a lot of terrain in hot, warm climates. Hittite chariots have to deal with a wider range of weather, much wetter environments, and a lot of mountains. There are mountain ridges up and down all through the Hittite homeland. So chariots have to be sturdier. They have to be able to carry a lot more weight because the chariot itself has to be a bit heavier. The horses also seem to have been bred to be a little bit more hunky. Because of that added strength and the speed penalty that you pay when you spec out your chariot for that kind of durability, they lean into the heaviness of the chariot in order to make it better armored. So the outside of the chariot box seems to have been covered in some kind of a plating, rawhide. We see things that look like either planks sometimes in Egyptian art and Hittite art. In later years, there are these maybe bronze bosses that show up, but it is a heavier chariot wall than you get in an Egyptian chariot. It's also larger. Hittite chariots accommodate a 3-person team. Egyptian chariots have a 2-person team, a driver and an archer. Hittite chariots have a driver and then kind of a multi-purpose 2-person team. We'll look at those coming up a little bit. The horses also sometimes, not always, but sometimes we see some indication that they may have been armored a little bit. Egyptian art doesn't seem to show the armor on it, but that makes sense. When Egyptians are fighting Hittites, it's often in a warmer area where putting more armor on the horses is going to give you a heat penalty. You're going to pay for that armor in performance. And Hittites aren't idiots. They know how to dress down when it's hot and dress up when it's warm. Let's see, anything else I want to say about this? This particular illustration of a Hittite chariot shows the axle pretty far forward, but in Egyptian art of the Battle of Kadesh, the axle is further back, very similar to Egyptian axles. We also think that the spring wasn't quite as acute an angle as this one has. I'm drawing this here with my red pen like that. That's a little acute. But essentially, it's not got that long taper of Egyptian chariots. It's got a shorter distance between horse and wagon box. Not wagon, chariot. I'm doing it now. So not as much of a zippy performance vehicle, but a much harder nut to crack. You've got to hit these things hard to get through the armor, or you have to put them in a situation where their weight is going to be a liability, like, say, driving them into a river would be a really good idea. Okay, so here we are looking at a picture of a Hittite chariot, now in Egyptian art. And there are a couple things I want to point out here. First, you can see the 3-man team in both of these chariots. So this is the front of the chariot here. You can see the tongue attaching to the harness here. In the center, This hand is holding onto the reins, so that's your driver, driving with his hands, not his backside. Here, there's the shield bearer, reaching forward with this. The name of this kind of shield is a Dipolon shield. You don't have to know this until Mycenae week, but I'm just putting that out there. So this is a small handheld shield because it only has to cover the upper bodies. And then in the back, you can see there's this person getting in. This chariot already has its full team. You can see the driver in the center, shield person here. And then at the back is our archer or javelin thrower. We see both arrows and javelins coming out of this third person. Interestingly, this guy has his arm kind of cocked back. The stone is damaged, so we can't see what's in that hand. He's either like giving directions. He might also be holding a javelin, which wouldn't be a bad idea. He can drive with the one hand, not butt. And then with a javelin, he can throw, which means that you have extra firepower. A very adaptable team. So this is a pretty sensible way to put your chariot team together. It's going to be added weight, but in context it makes sense. You can see both of these chariots have a rear-mounted axle, which makes perfect sense for the time. This moves back and forward before and after this battle. So I mentioned we do have some artwork of Hittite chariots, and here they are. Now, these are later. This is from about 900 to 700 BCE, which is 3-ish centuries, really more 4-ish since 1274. So it's been a minute. But this can still be useful in comparing Egyptian and Hittite chariot styles and philosophies. The wheels seem to be a little bit smaller. The wagon box is closer to the horses, although probably not this close. This is not a drivable chariot. Some of this had to be foreshortened to fit onto the wall panels. Much like the Egyptian art, the chariot is riding over a naked vanquished enemy. That's pretty standard. Everybody who has some kind of a war cart inevitably seems to have this scene on their walls. This, by the way, is from a later period where Hittites seem to have downsized their chariot crew. As of the Battle of Kadesh, we have a 3-person chariot team. There are only 2 people here. There's a driver, there's an archer, they're in battle. You wouldn't fire your arrow if you were just in a royal procession. So it seems that the Hittites are taking some things from the Egyptians, but they've still kept this very armored chariot box, and they're keeping with their burly horses out of practicality. They don't have their helmets on, which is interesting. It's nice. You can see their fancy hairdos. Probably, though, this is a convention to look good on a wall, but maybe not. Helmets might have been less common than we think. We do have other examples from this group of chariot art that do include helmets, just so you know. Moving ahead to personal protective equipment and armor for Egyptian troops. This is a modern illustration, pretty obviously. It's a composite showing the gear that folks would have worn to the Battle of Kadesh. This is based on Egyptian art and also finds in Egyptian tombs. We have more information about wealthy people's armor because wealthy people's graves survive better, but we do have some information about foot soldiers. So I'm going to start with the foot soldier and work my way up. The armor, we are pretty sure, because of the way it's wrapped around the body, this oblique angle that I'm putting in red pen is the kind of angle that doesn't make a ton of sense in metal armor that's going to pinch, but it does make sense with linen armor. Now you might think, linen? That's bad armor. Nope. Linen doesn't hold heat in the same way that metal armor does. In fact, you can burn yourself on metal armor if you put it on your bare skin after it's been out in the sun. Actually, know somebody who got 3rd-degree burns from putting on their armor directly onto their naked skin when it had been sitting out in the sun. the kind of thing that happens if you're friends with historical reenactors and experimental archaeologists. So, pro tip, don't put hot metal onto your skin. Also, put padding inside your helmet or you'll burn yourself and cook your brain. This also informs the headgear we see in the soldiers. So linen has long fibers. Egyptian linen was the finest in the region. Egyptian linen is still really good. They have an ideal environment for growing it, and they had a huge amount of cultural infrastructure invested in growing and producing linen textiles. In fact, in many periods, linen textiles were used as a kind of currency. People were enslaved en masse to create these linen textiles, so a huge amount of manpower went into this too. Linen, because it has these long, strong plant fibers, when layered over top itself, creates this flexible mesh that slows down projectiles when they're hitting the body and can often trap them before they get to the skin. We'll talk more about this when we talk about Greek armor. Linen's going to be a classic for many years to come. Suffice it to say now that linen acts a little bit like Kevlar. Kevlar is a better fiber because it's a synthetic engineered to do what Kevlar does, but linen serves some of that function and works really well in an age before firearms are a thing. So, linen on the outside, sometimes we see these waist shield things. This is an important area of the body to protect, particularly if you have genitalia hanging out in that area. You do not want that to be exposed to the major weapons of the day, which at close combat are bashing weapons. Egypt did have access to bronze around the Battle of Kadesh. They had to trade for it abroad, though. Not so much the copper. Egypt had plenty of copper, and copper weapons were a thing that you could get a hold of pretty easily. But the tin used in the alloy to make bronze, bronze is 9 parts copper, 1 part tin. Tin had to be imported from very far away. So either the Caucasus Mountains are the closest source to Egypt, if I'm remembering properly. Hittites could get it a little easier than Egyptians could. So bronze, you put where it matters. Now, bronze swords with edges were a thing, and that makes sense with bronze. Bronze holds an edge pretty well, and it makes for a flexible fighting blade too. If you were a fancy Egyptian, you might very well have a sword, but for most folks, they went instead for a weapon that could work as a bashing implement even when the blade had dulled a little bit. And we see this in copper format, and even with bronze, they still stick to these weapon types. One of them is the khopesh. This is labeled up top, and this is sometimes called a sickle sword because it looks a lot like a sickle, which is a blade for harvesting grass products like oat, wheat. You use this to cut the tops off and then process the wheat. If you had an army that was serving part-time in your military force and part-time living as farmers, then a weapon that felt a lot like an agricultural implement is a really good one to invest in. Now, the khopesh does have a blade along the outside edge. Sometimes you'll get it on the inside edge too, although that's less useful in warfare. But once that blade blunted, you could still do damage with this because the curve and the balance at the center of the grip, right at the hilt, puts all of your bashing force onto this edge, the outer edge of the curve. So when you smash this into somebody's bone, preferably their skull, but if you can't get at the skull, you can get their arm, their upper arm, but if you get the radius and ulna, that's still going to put that arm out of commission. You go for the collarbone, you break the collarbone, the arm is not going to work properly, they're not going to be able to stab you back. Or you can go down, get one of the leg bones. The femur is pretty tough. You're going to have to get lucky to smash somebody's femur. But you can do a lot of damage with this. You can even break their ribs. If you can't breathe, you can't fight very well. Bashing should not be underestimated as a tool of warfare. Bashing is a great way to incapacitate your enemies. Similarly, For upper class Egyptians, we do see some pharaohs with a khopesh, but the warhammer is more typical. Warhammers we've seen before. You may remember that the Sumerian war wagon folks, they had a lot of warhammers. Sumerian foot soldiers seem to have had them too. A warhammer does have what looks like a cutting edge here, but it's not very sharp. The edge is there not to cut the skin, but to concentrate the force of a crushing blow onto a smaller area of the skull. And the bevel edge is to keep it from getting stuck in the skull when it smashes through into the brain. Once you do that, it's lights out. Your enemy is going to be too busy having a seizure or dying to fight back. So this is a knockout blow, especially if you're fighting against people who have a head covering but nothing too rigid. Even if you've got rawhide, say you're Egyptian on Egyptian fighting, you're still going to be able to put enough force in through the rawhide that it's not going to dissipate before it hits the skull. You're going to crack a head with this. Now this one is a pharaoh's warhammer, so this is an extra fancy warhammer. It's got hieroglyphics in it, it's got art, it's lovingly made. That's why we have it. It was in a pharaoh's grave goods. But there are less complicated versions that you can have. On the chariot, meanwhile, you're going to be fighting with a longbow, as indeed our fellow here has. He's also wearing scale mail, which is a number of metal, sometimes we see rawhide too here, overlapping scales that are sewn onto a linen base with padding underneath. Scale mail is great because if one of the scales get damaged, it's really easy to replace one, so you can repair them in the field easily. They also tend not to catastrophically fail. If you bash one part of it, the rest of it's still going to be okay. It also is flexible, so you can bend, you can move, and that's important. You fight better when you can move. So all of this creates a best case scenario for your flexibility. Now this is quite long, but if you're standing in the back of a chariot, you don't need that much foot mobility. You're just going to plant yourself and fight from where you are. You do want to be careful not to make yourself top heavy, but other than that, you're golden and good to go. Finally, this is the war crown of a pharaoh. It's got a large clearance between the top of the head and the top of the helmet. This is so that bashing force is dissipated before it hits your skull. Very important. But also it's large, it's tall, it's beautiful blue color that you can see for meters and meters across a bright Egyptian desert. If you want to be super conspicuous and not get your skull bashed, this is a great choice. One thing I'd like to highlight, and it's something that's easy to miss in the reading, so hence the slide, is that horses don't have individual names in a chariot team. Ramses tells us the name of his team, Victory and Thebes. That's not the name of the horses individually, like one is not Victory and the other one is Thebes. Both of the horses share a name. That tells you a lot about what you need to make an effective combat chariot. You'll remember from the documentary just how much trouble they had getting matched height horses who could work together well enough to get a chariot around the paddock a couple of times and out on its lonesome in the desert. For an active combat team, they have to be really bonded, and they have to keep that bond even in the middle of the confusion of battle. This bond is so tight that you can't just get a new horse when one of the horses dies. They come as a team and they go as a team. We see this in Egyptian chariots. Here's a Hittite chariot demonstrating the same thing. When they draw these chariot teams, the horses are just a little bit behind each other in perspective, and their legs are all synced up. That's not just Egyptian art being very pretty and stylized. That is how your team has to function. Their legs have to be about in the same place and they have to be in lockstep. So much so that they seem to be one animal. Hence, Ramses naming his horses Victory and Thebes and just treating them like one horse. I wonder if he called them that when he was feeding them carrots. I hope he fed them carrots. They seem like very good boys. compare the Egyptian equipment to Hittite. Here we're looking at the artist rendition of the sorts of things we see in both Egyptian and in Hittite art. Because they're in a colder part of the world, they're wearing a lot more wool. This also has to do with the kinds of agriculture that were better developed in Anatolia. Egypt, it's hot, it's steamy, it's not a great place to work in wool. The wool felt. Rather, linen is the go-to fabric for Egypt. For the Hittites, wool then is easier to grow, but also makes for a better wearing garment. It has more warmth. It doesn't have the strength or armor potential that linen fiber does, but what it lacks in strength, it makes up for in loft. Wool is very bouncy, it's very squishy, so it makes a really good shock absorption fabric underneath of armor, and it also has a really good warming property when you're fighting in cooler climates, which is what we see folks dressing for here. Just like Egyptians, Hittites had access to scale mail, and if you could afford it, you would buy yourself some because it's a classic of the armor world. Helmets are high crown still, but we think mostly bronze, although you do get some rawhide versions of these helmets too, depending again on how fancy and wealthy you are. A lot of the equipment, other than that, looks similar. We don't have the same bashing weapons, but we do see swords. These are easier to get a hold of for the Hittites because they're closer to areas manufacturing tin, and tin is an essential component of bronze. For Egypt, the tin comes from farther away. They have to get it through trade, so fewer people have access to as much bronze as they do in the Hittite Empire. Similarly, actually, what else was I going to say? Yes. Now, bow types are close to what we see in Egypt. Longbows fired from chariot back, javelins with bronze tips. We have those in Egypt too. It's just the Hittites have access to a little bit more armoring, which explains the decisions they're making in their chariot corps. They're armoring their horses a little bit more heavily, they're putting more armor onto their chariot boxes, and they have access to more ranged weapons from the firing platform of the chariot. Just to compare, so here are some of the artistic originals that this reconstruction is based off of. Again, this is from 900-ish, 700-ish in the Hittite capital of Hattusa. And we can see round shields. The round shields seem to be a later shield type. The kinds of shields we see in Egyptian art circa 1274 are the longer, skinnier, crescent-cut Diplon shield type, which again will be more important next week than it is this week. This week, don't worry about that too much. They're carrying either spears or javelins, and it's hard to tell which here. So a javelin is a spear for throwing. There are a couple words for a thrusting spear. We'll just call them thrusting spears in this part of the course. They're holding them center, which suggests they're center balanced, so probably javelins, but again, it's unclear. You can see there those helmet types that your reconstruction put into bronze. Bronze is a likely material, especially for soldiers like these who would have been part of a royal guard. You put your fanciest troops on your walls, and these are from a king's walls, so they're going to be the nice ones. And that's about all I want to say about those. Now we're going to move on to the evolution of Ramses' Battle of Kadesh art, because he really makes this his selling point over the years, and the artistic version of what this battle looks like changes as Ramses gets older and builds more temples. This is from Nefertari's temple at Abu Simbel. Nefertari was Ramses' chief wife. He had 3 total, 50 concubines. He got around, is what I'm saying. Not judging. This is actually how you do diplomacy in the ancient world, is you marry everybody's daughter that you have a treaty with, or at least like you get sent a concubine, so you end up racking up large numbers of women that you have around for diplomatic reasons, but it's also an insurance policy because you want extra backup kids in case your kids don't make it through childhood, because the ancient world is an unsafe place to raise your kids. That's Ramses. So, in order to tell his chief wife just how he felt about her, he decided to build her a temple. You remember the Luxor temple is dedicated to Ramses and some other gods, but Ramses. This is meant to be her temple. It was across the river from a temple to him. It's like there are 2 twin temples there for all eternity on the southern border where everyone across the border could come look at their awesomeness. However, Ramses' temple for his wife included massive statues of Ramses in the front and in the back. They're massive statues of her too, but they're not as big as the statues of Ramses, which is an interesting move. Like, I'm wondering if one Valentine's Day I'm gonna come home and find like giant statues of my husband in my living room, and he's gonna be like, "Hey babe, I love you so much, I made you my statues." And I'll be like, actually that would be kind of cute. I'd have some questions about who paid for that, but yeah, okay. But I'd appreciate it more if he made giant statues of me, is all I'm saying. At any rate, so this is Ramses. It just tells you what life married to Ramses the Great would have been like. In this picture, Ramses is attacking the citadel of Kadesh. We know because it's in the hieroglyphics, it's labeled. Here's the description. So I'm going to ask you guys, pause, think for a minute, and then tell me what's different about this version of the Battle of Kadesh? Okay. Okay. So Ramses, our hero, is attacking the citadel of Kadesh directly. I guess we should be glad he's got his bodyguard with him, all 3 of them. So that's nice. But get out my blue pen so I can highlight. He's not facing a Hittite army, is he? Where is the Hittite army? Apparently this is the Hittite army, is the 1 herdsman with his 1 male and 1 female cow, and they're running away in terror with their hands up, looking super freaked out. On the hill, someone who appears to be Mu'atali. For some reason, Mu'atali is wearing like a cape. I don't think he's wearing. Well, of course he's not wearing pants, because this isn't a pants culture, because they're on chariots. They don't need pants. But he's not wearing a skirt either, so he's got his butt hanging out, which in Egyptian art, no, Egyptians wear clothes. Greek people are going to have another attitude towards nudity, but yeah, he's not quite dressed, and he's on his knees with his hands up, begging for his life. That never happened. At no point in the Luxor temple and its inscriptions does Mu'atali get on his knees and beg for his life. Behind him, the Egyptian archers have convenient lines of sight to take pot shots at the Hittites on the walls, including this one poor dude who's getting an arrow between the eyes. First, this is not how you defend a citadel. You generally stay down a little bit. So this is artistic license here. The Hittites are behaving really ineptly in a siege situation and are getting shot. There's this This person's just like hanging over the edge, and then up at the top. So not only are we shooting at people begging for their lives, but in the center we have a female figure holding her baby up in the air where the arrow is going. Like, this is bad parenting. This is very bad parenting. But the artist is putting it on here to show that not only are there men defending the walls, begging Ramses and his one chariot and 3 bodyguards for mercy, but also women with their babies are like, no, don't kill my baby, which is kind of horrifying if you think through the implication tree here. Oh gosh. Part of what they're implying is that they're begging Ramses for mercy so that they don't get enslaved and or killed. Now, if you recall, Ramses' own earlier version of this battle did not end with anybody's women being kidnapped and sold into slavery. In fact, the treaty includes extradition agreements, so they're giving people back to the Hittites. So this is interesting. Now, my point is not, oh, look at Ramses flip-flopping and backpedaling. That's kind of my point, but I'm not picking on him for this. Rather, this underscores the importance of using artistic sources with caution, and as Richardson says, viewing kingly accounts of how warfare is with a healthy dose of skepticism and caution, because these images exist for a purpose. Just as much as modern journalistic pieces exist for a purpose, and war reporting exists for a purpose, and your presidential candidate's webpage exists for a purpose. I'm not criticizing them for that. That's the reality of political systems with single people being granted power, inclusive of the power to monopolize violence and force. This is just how things work, but we need to keep this in mind. The minute we start reading all ancient texts as reliable without question is the time where we're going to make some mistakes. And this isn't revisionist history. This isn't historians backpedaling, although a little bit. Yeah, old military history was heavily invested in taking texts at face value. But we're not just being skeptical out of a vacuum here. We found more texts. We found some surviving accounts that seem to be letters from Ramses' army where they're complaining that the food is horrible. We've found a cuneiform text from the Hittites saying, yeah, it wasn't like that. And we've also found, in some cases in later wars, third-party accounts saying, yeah, no, they're both lying. And also common sense. Leaders write like leaders have to, because you need, or at least it is difficult to lead without lying, or at least stretching the truth a little bit. If you manage it, though, good luck, all the respect. That would be super refreshing. But I don't think we're going to see it anytime soon. Okay. So that's Nefertari's temple at Abu Simbel. This is also on the southernmost border. This is yet another border that Ramses was fighting a war in to firm up the boundaries. So likely this is both a message to Egyptians, but also to Egypt's neighbors to the south, saying, behold our might. We roll up with our one chariot, and our enemies just give up on the spot behind their very nicely built city walls. That message in that context means something different than it would be if this were like Luxor in Egypt's heartland, where mostly Egyptians are seeing it. All right, so let's look at yet another version of the battle and yet another Ramses temple. This is the mortuary temple in Thebes. This is again in the heartland of Egypt, so we're back into Egyptian territory. Mortuary temple is the temple that Ramses built for Ramses' dead body. So when Ramses died, this is the place where his body would be prepared for mummification, rather, and this is the place where his descendants were supposed to come to make offerings to him as Osiris, dead Ramses, the god of the underworld, Ramses. So let's have a look here at what Ramses is giving as a message to his posterity. In some ways, this is a marriage of the two Kadesh art pieces we've seen so far. This is your time to pause if you want to do like the spot the differences thing. Okay. If you look at the city, we've still included it. Of course, it's included in the first image as well, much like in the Abu Simbel temple to Nefertari. People are coming to the walls, and up at the top you can see where arrows have been shot through some kind of a flag standard thing. I'm not sure what that is. But in this case, it's escalated. You have people like jumping off the walls, apparently, because Ramses is just that scary. Let me switch to red. Be a little more visible. Yeah, there we go. And then you've also got Egyptians putting ladders up against the walls and trying to climb in. That didn't happen in the Luxor temple. There was not any attempt, we think, to breach the walls and lay a siege, but yet here we are doing that. We do have a Hittite chariot team riding away in a panic, and many other Hittite chariot teams underneath Ramses' giant chariot. He's steering with his butt again, of course. Now, that said, we do have some Hittites fighting back. There's somebody with a spear poking it at invaders. There's somebody with a bow who is confusingly shooting in the opposite direction of the invading Egyptians. I mean, maybe they're on the other side somewhere. It's an interesting choice of image. But the final take-home here is that Ramses II returns to Kadesh again and again in his public relations campaigns. He makes it into the cornerstone of his right to rule. And whenever there's any doubt as to who's in charge, he brings up Kadesh again. It becomes his calling card, his ticket. Now, this is not the only victory Ramses brags about, but it is a big one because it's, well, victory. Here we go. It's working on me too, isn't it? It is the first of a series, and one made when he's very young. From the Kadesh campaign, he goes on, as I said earlier, to then fix the border in Libya, and then he moves south for our next campaign. Here we go. In sometimes you'll hear these called the Nubian campaigns. That's why I've gone for this word here. This is in the south, within the modern Sudan. The border between Egypt and the Sudan changes a lot in the ancient world, so that's a good reference point if you're trying to figure out where are these places now. But back in the day, this is a clear line around the cataracts, so the waterfalls that begin breaking up the Nile in its headwaters. The Nile River flows from south to north, and that's helpful to keep in mind. It's one of the few rivers that flows south to north. Often they'll call Upper Egypt the part that's upriver, but irritatingly, upriver is south, so up is down in Egypt. I say that because it's super confusing, so there you go. On this border, then there is a lot of movement, and several dynasties come from this region south of Egypt, including the dynasty just before the Persian invasion. So a lot of pharaohs do come from this region, and there isn't this stark color line that you can see in this painting where they've chosen to represent the difference between Egyptians and Nubians with skin tone, where you have medium, dark, and then extra melanin. Even when dynasties from this area end up in power, they represent themselves with this medium brown skin, which is super interesting and revealing. One of the things that we have to check ourselves on when we're looking at ancient art is A, interpreting skin color as race, because that's not quite how it works here, but B, assuming that skin color in art corresponds to the skin color people actually had in life. We're going to get into why that's something that should give us caution moving ahead, but suffice to say, you would have had like a spectrum, and people would have looked more alike in Egypt than they're doing here. But there are some things that are about the same. I mean, nobody's on a chariot, and there aren't any walled citadels, but we are trampling an army underneath our chariot. We're giant, we're steering with our butt. This is Ramses making himself look good again. One last stop before we move on to Ramses' legacy a bit more. There are conventions for depicting prisoners of war, which is what the POW abbreviation stands for. If you're not familiar, a POW is a prisoner of war. This is a modern term, I'm retrojecting it, but it's a fair term. At the top, we're looking at Egyptian art. This is from yet another of Ramses' temples, and this is interesting because this is a scene showing what happens to the two shepherds that Ramses' troops come across and interrogate at the beginning of the Kadesh narrative. You remember when he's like, yeah, we came across a couple of shepherds and we asked them where the Hittites were, and they said, oh man, yeah, the Hittites are in Aleppo, you're fine. Well, apparently they kept a hold of these folks, and when it turned out that the Hittites are actually behind the hill. According to Ramses, these people were beaten to death, essentially, and that's what the scene shows at the center. These two dudes are the shepherds, and you see the Egyptians with sticks. And this is part of a ritual humiliation thing. Beating with sticks is the move of somebody caught in a crime. It's not a death in war, it's an ignominious death. This is meant to be humiliating. This fellow is either holding a stick or perhaps ropes, although these folks don't seem to be tied. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as spies, because that's how Ramses talks about them, as spies. It is unclear whether that's actually what was up with them, but this is a pretty typical treatment of people who are captured in war. Either they're killed in an unpleasant way, or they are trafficked and enslaved. But this isn't just an Egypt thing. Down in the corner, we have another panel from that wall frieze we've been looking at in Hattusa, the Hittite capital. Here are some Hittites bringing a prisoner of war to the king. They have them held by the hair, like Ramses was holding people by the hair right before he hits them in the head with his warhammer. Hittites do it too. This is pretty standard for people in the ancient Near East, all the ancient Near East, and I'm including like Greece, the Levant, Anatolia, Egypt. This is just the common shared language of war art. And this is part of the psychological impact of this war art, because it's meant to be viewed both by people in your country and people visiting from outside. For people in your country, it's a don't mess with the pharaoh king person. You are going to have violence used against you if you do. But to outsiders, it's saying that, hey, if you try to take our territory, this is what we will do to you. This is meant to be a psychological tactic. And we are missing a trick if we view warfare only as something that happens when people are holding weapons and doing direct violence to each other. Warfare begins with communication. With all Apologies von Clausewitz, war is not just diplomacy by other means. It's a famous quote in warfare theory. Rather, diplomacy is, in many ways, the first step of warfare. And you can't separate one out from the other. Communication is an important part of having an effectively defended state, for better or for worse. So let's meet the guy. We have his body. This is actually Ramses II. Not just Ramses II, but we've met. This is the most famous person I've ever met. When his body was at the Field Museum in Chicago in the late 1980s, I begged and begged and begged and begged until my parents took me to go meet him. Yeah, child Dr. Jones Lewis really wanted to be an Egyptologist when she grew up. Grown-up Molly is very happy with her life choices. This has worked out really well for me. But yes, I got to meet him. He looked exactly like this, very mummified and very brittle. His tomb is lost. His body was rescued from looters and then put into this cache of royal mummies meant by the priesthood to keep them safe. And it worked. It's great. We have him. We know it's him because there's a toe tag that has his name on it. Carbon dating fits, like, this is him. Like, within a reasonable degree of certainty, we're looking at Ramses II. The age is right, too. This body died in its 90s and fits everything that should be true about Ramses. So on his hair, you can see a little bit of it here, still left, and over here. He was old, he was a little bald looking. Though that is kind of a gingerish, carroty color because he dyed it with henna during his life. But underneath the skin level at the roots, under microscopic analysis, we can see what kind of melanin pigments are deposited on the hair shaft, which gives us a surprise. Ramses II was ginger. He was a redhead. And that fits with some of our evidence, because his father's name, Seti, is derived from Set, the Egyptian god of the deserts, of the sun, of destruction, of chaos sometimes. Also Osiris's brother. Now, with caution, Ramses II wasn't a redhead like, Viking redhead. Like, that's not the image. Red hair genes show up in all human populations all over the globe. This is a regular mutation that humans get. And outside of, say, Ireland and Northern Europe, one of the populations with the highest redheaded gene density are North African people of the Libyan interior. So in the modern day, this would be Berbers. Berbers have quite a few redheads. So when we think about an ancient Egyptian redhead, we're not imagining somebody who's like super pale and from Europe. Sorry, white supremacists, you don't get this one. However, to Egyptians, they believed that people with red hair were cursed suspect because of this connection to Set, their god of the desert and destruction. In fact, why Set gets identified with the desert is that Berber people come from the interior desert of North Africa. So there's very Libyans that Ramses II is bragging about beating up on. That's these folks, which is interesting. So super interesting when we take into account when Ramses depicts himself in art, he's got black hair and he's got medium red skin in the same way that other Egyptians do. He depicts himself in a way that fits with the supremacy notions that ancient Egyptians were operating under. There's a hint though, because his father's name means essentially like child of Set. And it seems that his dynasty did lean into the redheaded thing a little bit when trying to make themselves seem really badass. If you can say, yeah, we are the descendants of the god of destruction, so you better not mess with us, that's clever. It works out pretty well for you. So at any rate, Here's the man. Hi. And next to him is the Hittite copy of the treaty I had you read. So this is the Kadesh Treaty, as I said. It's the earliest surviving international peace treaty. And this gives you an idea of what the Hittite copy looks like. So you may have been really confused reading because they're big blank spaces. This is why there are blank spaces. The tablet itself is made out of clay. It broke. It had to be reassembled. So everywhere where there's like kind of this red terracotta colored concrete stuff, that's where these pieces of tablet have been stuck back together. And it's got a front and a back. There's a mirror behind it where you can see the back showing up in the mirror. I took this from a reproduction in the Museum of Anatolian Antiquities. This isn't actually, no, wait, I grabbed this off the internet. This is the real one. Behind it is the mirror. You can see the other side of it a little bit, and it's also cut off at about the same point. The Egyptian copy continues because it's on the wall of a surviving temple. I think there are a few places where it's chipped or kind of hard to read. There's been some erosion. The Egyptian copy is just in better shape. But the Hittite copy lets us see what's the same, what's different. A couple of my takeaways, and you can come up with your own ideas. And one of the things I'll have you do on the essay test is to talk to me a little bit about what's in this treaty and why you think these would have been important goals for the different parties. Is that the Hittite copy is written from the Hittite perspective and the Egyptian copy is written from the Egyptian perspective. So they'll be like almost the same terms but with the names switched. They're also in different languages. The Egyptian copy is in Egyptian and the Hittite copy is in Hittite. So there are little linguistic differences. Just all you need to know about that. One last thing we've got to talk about, though, is why Ramses didn't have more border wars. Essentially, he firms up the Hittite border, he takes care of the Libyans, he fixes the southern border, but he's in power for a really long time. He kind of stops it with the wars of conquest and just sits tight for the rest of his reign. Not just that, but after this period, the Hittite Empire begins to shrink too. So this isn't because the Hittites get more powerful. The Hittites also have to retrench rather quickly after the Battle of Kadesh. Within the next couple centuries, we see weakening on the borders of these Bronze Age communities and eventually fragmenting and simplification in the archaeological records. Something is happening that makes large complex societies no longer quite as viable and makes subsequent monarchs after Ramses not have quite the amount of financial resources to draw on. So what's up? What's going on? There's a clue even as early as Ramses' account of the Battle of Kadesh. At one point, he talks about how he beat the Sheridan pirates and then took a bunch of captives with him to Kadesh. This is interesting to us because it's one of the first mentions of, well, pirates. And it's not just Egyptian records. Hittite records start mentioning pirates at about this time. Other cultures in the Levant begin mentioning piracy and raids. There are apparently these people coming from the sea who are causing havoc along the coast, rolling up in their boats, doing a lot of damage, grabbing the nice stuff, and then leaving. And it's such a problem that it means all of these world powers, especially the Hittites and the Egyptians, have to stop fighting each other to go deal with this whack-a-mole pirate problem on their coast. So these people we refer to collectively as the Sea Peoples, and the S on the peoples is a clue to what's going on here. This seems to be some kind of multicultural alliance, maybe coming in from the sea and cooperating with each other to form raiding parties against the big, wealthy inland empires of the late Bronze Age. They seem to also be raiding in Mycenaean Greece, which is our next stop in this tour of the Bronze Age in the Near East. So coming up, they'll show up again. This begins happening around 1300 BCE, so right about the time 1274 is the Battle of Kadesh, so that's the early days, and this picks up and intensifies as time goes on. They seem to be tapering off around 1100 BCE, partially because the big empires that they've been raiding and picking away at are no longer able to maintain a coastal presence. This does seem to shut down a lot of coastal trading activity from inland. Now, there are other things going on too. Climate change and poor harvests seem to be involved. We don't have a great deal of information about how closely federated these sea peoples were, what language they spoke, what was going on with them. We think they might have been coming from the north into the Aegean Sea this way, and that's our best guess. We aren't 100% sure that the Sheridan pirates are these people. So what do we know? Well, we do have some art. Not a lot, but some. Because think about it for a minute. You put up art when you defeat, or at least don't lose against somebody. That's a great excuse to put them in your art. But if they're winning, you're not going to put them in your art. Sometimes you'll put them in your art if you want to galvanize resistance, but for the most part, you don't make a lot of fancy art about the stuff you're losing. However, here is one relief. So this is from Medinat Habu in, I think this is modern day Israel. This is by an Egyptian artist done, I think, when Egypt still had a military presence in the region, showing some of these sea peoples. And different sea peoples look different. We see very different kinds of armor and arms and weapons, even at the same time period. So this is one such group. Their armor, you can see these kind of angled bands. This is likely linen armor, although it does look awfully similar to elf armor from Lord of the Rings. I'm just going to put that out there. And these helmets are one of the few examples in history of people actually wearing horned helmets. Horned helmets are not a Viking thing, by the way. Decorated helmets are a thing in some cultures, Vikings not so much, because unless the horns are very loosely affixed, they're a liability. Somebody can grab onto the horn on your helmet. If a sword strike comes from your head downwards, the sword can catch on the helmet, and if it's tied too closely to your head, it can snap your neck. So horns on your helmet are a safety risk. You generally want decorations on your helmet to be on a frontward facing axis because you're not going to get a lot of blows laterally. They're going to be coming at you from the front of your head or the back of your head. So just keep that in mind the next time you're picking a helmet. But it seems some people did indeed go in for horned helmets, and here are some of them. It's a great show of confidence in your own superiority. They here are disembarking from a ship. You can see the edge, and they're carrying round shields. Keep that in mind. This is going to be important when we talk about Bronze Age Greece. I will say, though, as a teaser, round shields do seem to be associated with the sea peoples, and perhaps this is something they introduced to the region. That's more exciting when we get to, say, 5th century Greece. And as a final note, here's another relief sculpture showing another group of sea peoples. Now, I mentioned we see a lot of variation when we do see rare images of sea peoples in art. Here's another one. These folks don't look at all like the sea folks we looked at a minute ago. There is no horned helmet. The helmets are this either a bronze brow band, perhaps bronze, with horsehair packed at the top and then cut into this flat surface at the apex, which was a pretty neat choice. This would have looked really nifty on the battlefield, I think. Our artist has given you a rendition of what they might have looked like. Here, they've had their armor removed. You can see the artist has given you their kilts, which either have reinforcing bands on them or woven in stripes, kind of a check pattern. Very nifty looking folks. This person seems to have maybe some ritual scarring too on the cheeks. Scholars have suggested these might be Philistines. Maybe, maybe not. If you're familiar with the Hebrew Bible and have always wanted to put a name to the faces, here you are. That might be them, might not be. And this kind of is an exception that proves the rule. These particular sea peoples are on this art because they've been captured. You can tell because they've got their hands tied together, like these fellas. This person seems to have his elbows tied together over his head, sort of like this kind of posture, or this. So they've been tied in a way that they can't resist, but their legs are free so that they can be marched off and sold into slavery, because that's what happens next if you don't get bashed in the head with a warhammer. These sea peoples had a very bad day, assuming they existed at all. Again, just because a pharaoh puts you on his wall doesn't mean that you have been utterly defeated, is all I'm saying. And with that thought, I leave you with the enigmatic, frustrating mess that is the Kadesh documents and artifacts. We have a victory that's not really a victory, a treaty that outlines a ceasefire, and a situation in which a campaign may very well have ended not because the two parties involved had achieved a strategic superiority, but rather because a third party had begun causing so much problems that empire on empire warfare was no longer profitable, and we have to solve our problems with diplomacy instead. I mean, I said diplomacy is a kind of warfare, and I stand behind this, but diplomacy often is a cheap and economical solution to fighting way too many wars on way too many fronts. With that thought, I leave you. Take care, be well, and I'll see you next week. Ciao.